Can we look a bit at the prior stage in a way, the process? What is a whole process? If we might bring that to mind. It's got to be about something, this thing, not just in an abstract vacuum. So there's obviously processes such as to do with food and with making an object and a work of art and so on. But let's go back then to that prior stage. I say the context, and what's the context of the whole thing is what is the whole? Can anybody give an example of a whole process, something which has its unity? All right, well, I'll intervene in and say, well, yes, this theme of a journey has a lot of implications for this mysterious sevenfoldness, which is talked about, and the possibility of the fact that the journeys from A to B are usually, or possibly, not in a straight line, but not. There are moments in the process of a journey which determine, well, whether you get there, its quality, whatever it is. So I'm just following up what you said, this example of a journey, making a journey. And later on, I might refer to material which is there in world literature to do with the quest, the journey, such as the vision quest and so on, or making a pilgrimage, whatever it is. So let's imagine it now, making a journey. In your, I suppose you were driving or something to Claremont, could you identify anything like critical points in it? So that is of some interest to me because you start with what is taught in the books about the two shocks in the Enneagram, but there might be more and in different places. So suspend that for the moment. And anybody think of an experience or a journey? Because you'd mentioned making a stop. And why do you make a stop? You have to refuel. So at the moment, I'll just suggest, and pushing it, of course, you say this is a moment because you have a point of contact with something outside your driving. Something new comes in, which is obviously food, gasoline, whatever you call it in America. So that's a candidate. There's something there's different. You stop that process and something else comes into play. And you would argue, of course, if you didn't do that stop, you would eventually peter out and not get there. Do anybody suggest in their experiences of a journey, are there points where something different happens? That's a very helpful example. It relates very much to something I will touch upon a little bit more later on, but about the way in which you go on a journey and you might find people who have gone on the journey before you or know the terrain or something like that. And I was thinking, I may get the name wrong and so on, but those two American explorers who were helped in a journey across America by Pocahontas, the Indian woman, who helped them at a certain point as the territory. So you go on a journey and you worked it out yourself. You know what you've done, read the guidebook or whatever it is, but then you meet somebody who's got the experience of being on a journey before you. This signifies someone with superior information. They know something or they could know something that you do not know. Yes, this is right. The moment of looking at these moments along the way, you go on a journey. I want to evoke in your creative imagination that you just don't go on doing the same thing. The journey has a structure to it, and there are critical moments. It might be quite banal, actually. You say, have us go to the stop and you buy a map. Well, of course, one doesn't do that very much these days, but whatever it is, I want you to consider this first shock is the getting information or awareness from somebody who knows something that you don't know. They're getting new information. This crude way before with the thing about having a hamburger and gasoline and so on. You're putting material in yourself which you haven't carried with you, but you're getting it from outside. Now, anybody else swing into this? That's good. You see, it's really not mysterious, mystical things, but very ordinary things which happen. Well, let's think about the side of, the unforeseen. I mean, we start off on a journey, then suddenly found there's been an accident or roadworks or something, and the route you had anticipated is no longer possible. Well, you go. So there's want to conjure up in your minds a feeling and apprehension of hazard and uncertainty, because we live in a real world. We're not in a little bubble. And sometimes there is this breaking of the bubble, and something goes through the skin of the bubble and touches us. So it can be treated both as a helping hand, but also as a threat or a distraction. As you say, well, no, he didn't actually say it, but Stephen suggests you might get stopped somewhere and get distracted, and then suddenly your time schedule is out of work. I mentioned this distraction because it's just, again, it's a kind of such ordinary things, people don't look at it carefully. And so you set off on a path or an effort, a project, whatever it is, and then suddenly, not suddenly, but at some point you find that you're lost the plot, or you're not really doing what you set out to do, or it's, somebody said, fading away, or whatever it is. There is a need for a recharging of the system. But I'm trying not to say too much. You see, I'm trying to get you that utilized. You've got all this material in you, all your experience, all your associations. Let your imagination go. What does it feel like? What happens? What can happen? There is what turns it into an adventure. I'll come to that in a moment. So, not so. I'm looking at the time a bit carefully. Stephen, could you show, I think it's figure 1, whatever it is. Can you get that up somehow? This is just to remind you, as you see it, you may think I'm being very rude in the sense, but people don't look at what's in front of them, don't consider what there is plainly in front of you. And this ordinary assumption people make that they see what's in front of their eyes is a load of shit. All you see really most of the time are just memories and associations. Well, have we got it? There we are. Okay, this is just to remind you. Okay. Now, we have, again, very difficult with the diagram. Diagram can shut you out. It's just a flat face or something, but no, just you get into it and you follow it. Follow it so that the lines and so on, you are actually following it physically, sort of physically. And so I talked, have the circulation going from 0, 3, 6 back to 9, shown by those arrows outside. And then we have these points highlighted of 3 and 6 and 9, excuse me, which is associated with this figure, you see. Now this figure, the triangle, I give it a name sometimes, the logos, which is an old Greek word, meaning kind of the law of reality, the meaning, the word, is something coming into our world, which is of a different order, is point of an adventure. Like in Lord of the Rings and so on, you go on this pilgrimage, this journey, voyage and so on, and something can happen to you, something different can enter your life. And that's the big promise. But for the moment, I wanted to look at, if I put it as 2 arrows coming down from 9, 0 to 6 and 3. And so I think that something comes out of that top point. Now, this is the whole, if you like. And I argue in my treatment of the Enneagram that this top point is a critical one, because in it is enfolded everything which is in the outer circle. And so sometimes some things enfold out of that. So there's some influence coming out of that, so that you can say that things happen to you on this journey, which might seem simply accidental or contingent, but they also might mean synchronous. So that's a possibility. So I'll stop there. But I must stop, not say too much. Because you see, every chance you've got to actually make use of your experience, transform it, it matters. It's rather like, I was reminded of Rilke. They say the ordinary people think that a poet just expresses their emotions. He says a lot of twaddle, Yes, the real poet uses his emotions to say something meaningful. That's very different. A real poet doesn't express his or her emotions. Number 6, you see, I put here differently, and it's a different kind of intersection. So the idea here, you see this, in a way it's a bit mystical. These arrows I've got in the triangle, touching the outer circle. The outer circle is in what happens. You go on the journey with this 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles, 40 miles, and you can map it around here. But then you're saying something comes into that from another realm, maybe. But it's implying this, and you can see it's a way, it's a simplification, it's an abstraction, it's an ideal case. There are 2 sides to this intervention, 2 different kinds. And I'll put it in a simple way and try and shut myself up. And in this number 3, you see it's really coming from the noble world, it's just like you can, there's going to be a pit stop or another person, not ever it is. But there's something in a way which appears to be coming from outside. Now, what could be the complement on 6? What I'm saying here is a prelude to trying to emphasize this whole thing, which I don't think is much appreciated. Now, the Enneagram, you can divide it into 2 sides, the left and the right. I can almost say that the right-hand side is more tangible and the left-hand side more intangible and elusive. So what is this 3? Oh, here's a suggestion, you see. But I would love you to make your own suggestions. Allow yourself to go. It was really frustrating so much talking with people all the time, inhibiting themselves, closing themselves down, saying, don't allow themselves to come up with what surging away inside them into the new possibilities and say, well, there is, I would say that the line from 0 to 3 has a character being from the past, as the line from, we call it from 9 to 6 is a character being from the future. So I'll stop there for a moment. I think, is there anything in your experience to correspond to this? See? Because the 6 is not, how to say, it's not in the system. It's not determined, not deterministic in the way of 3. It's deterministic, like you see, you know you're going to stop at a certain place. But no, there's something here which is not. But it's that which can make all the difference. So anybody comment, please? So feel free to tell me I'm speaking a load of crap. I don't know. I love being wrong. I suggest something here. You see, what's involved in this place of number 6, so to speak, is the meaning. It's like T.S. Eliot's line, we had the experience but missed the meaning. And then he goes on to elaborate about this. To see, what does it mean? The things can happen to us, like in life. You have extraordinary coincidences can happen or strange things happening, but we don't know what it means. And a lot of people ask, what does it mean? Does it mean anything? And then is it just contingent and all the rest of it? And so I suggested that it could, one way, which is my way, particular way of saying, is related to what's coming from the future. For example, and this is, you see, I'm not speaking in terms of fiction. I'm a 6, you get to the point you realize what your journey is really for, which could change. You must have had this experience to start on a journey or start doing something, with a certain kind of purpose in mind and so on. It gets to a certain point, and it can be a very confusing point, and then you suddenly realize that was not what it was about at all. And here I refer to, and I always appeal to people, say, the stories, read the stories, the myths, the fairy stories, and all the rest of it. These are, why they are written is for this purpose of evoking our creative imagination, being open to the real influences happening to us, which are coming to us through our ordinary experience. So there's enormous potential in this 6, which is, I say, as the Tali said, how to make use of what this outer thing, making it inner. But many possibilities of interpretation come in. And don't be afraid of this multiple possibilities, because this world of meaning is where you get, it's the focal thing is multiple meanings all at once. And that's the insight of this 3rd segment of the Enneagram. And it's quite explosive. So I'm aware of the time. I'm giving you my excuse to press on. I'll just check a little bit on the note here. Oh, yes. Now, I can only refer to it because there's so much material. I'll hardly address a fraction of it. But you see, the notion of the word shock and so on, we have introduced, because he had this theory of octaves, which some of you have mentioned, and the musical scale, which he treats in a very idiosyncratic way. And persisting as 3 is like do, re, mi, fa, mi, fa interval, the semitone, and he goes on about this, how it needs a helping hand and so on. That's I can't go into it, unfortunately, because there's a whole world of these musical structures and forms date back at least 6,000 years into Mesopotamia. But they're supposed to be evoking the way the universe is constructed, everything is constructed, but find it in your own experience. But the final thing I'll say, well, not almost the final thing here I'll say is Please conjure up and use the material you have in you. I feel it's like most people are stagnating in them. Oh, it's raw material to be brought into illuminations. But it's the final thing I'll say, going back to the two sides. No, I'll tell you things about two sides and things about three actions. Two sides you mentioned before I stated it, which is also part represented the difference between 3 and 6. And it's a kind of duality. But this duality, you see, Gurdjieff doesn't mention it explicitly, so people don't look into it very much because he hasn't said so. But this intrinsic thing about duality, which is in quantum physics, in the principle of complementarity and so on, these two sides to things, I should emphasize about Enneagram, is the things around from left to right are all the same, only in the outer circle. When you get to the inner process, they differ, and you have this duality. There are two kinds of reality which are the same thing. And it's used there is even a principle in physics called duality. Two ways of explaining something or identified, and it can lead to new discoveries. So all of that, you see, it's hovering around this. When I say what's behind the Enneagram, it's just multitudes of worlds. We have a simple focus to enable us to get hold of it. All right, I have to leave it there because of the time constraints. And so I go now to the, I'm going to go back to Gurdjieff's comment about you really can't understand the Enneagram without doing the movements. But in this particular one, you have a picture. I want to go back to the sevenfoldness of the process. I mean, I can't remember what I did last time. Oh, I did a little bit. The fuzzy number 7. And we talked about the reference to the modest article, the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, which I love throwing at people because they're getting this authoritarian Gurdjieff schema with, like Walsh in his wonderful lecture he gave on the movement, he took over captions like the inexorable law, and all that kind of almost fascist phrasing of things. No, it's not like that. It has to be treated a bit lightly. But this one, you might understand it in many ways. This gives the simple process of a journey, an inner journey, in 7 stages, and is an element which is contained in this whole insight. So, please, Stephen.
Okay, in the chat, I'm dropping a link for YouTube. So you should hopefully be able to click and it'll open up the file in your browser, and so you can play the YouTube video there. You might need to copy and paste, but again, we'll be watching the video separately from Zoom, and then it's about 5 minutes long. Then we'll come back again.
Well, good luck. Stephen, just want to add in here.
Oh, sure.
You see, it starts off with the straight sequence of it, but then it does a different. All the combinations of the order and the structure are gone through the permutations, and this is an important part of what we see later in the inner lines of the Enneagram. Thank you, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. What we're going to do now is a little experiment in how we pay attention, or where we put our attention. And of course, we've all worked with that idea and all of our sittings and movements and things that we do with our attention. I'd like to introduce to you a way of working with your attention that you may not be familiar with, that you may find interesting and useful in provoking insight. I want you to turn yourself in a direction that is more complex than your computer screen. It could be your desktop, it could be your kitchen, where just turn your chair around and look at something other than the screen. And notice where your eyes tend to rest on possibly objects in front of you. An object or a group of objects that are in front of you. And allow your attention to be focused on an object. And once you've got that, I want you to shift your attention to the peripheral vision so that your attention is on what is within your peripheral vision, even though you're faced toward the object. You're no longer focusing on that object. You're allowing that object to just disappear because all of your attention is on the peripheral vision, whatever you can sense in that peripheral vision. And I want you to hold your attention on that peripheral vision for several minutes. We often in sittings have been instructed to engage a diffused vision and do the sittings with the eyes opened. And I'm saying, no, not diffused vision, but your attention is peripheral. So you still have your attention fixed, not diffused, but fixed on the peripheral. And as you do this, notice what comes into your attention field. Perhaps you were not aware of before. If you can, stretch your attention a little further than your peripheral, going slightly behind yourself. So the peripheral is where it begins, and you can allow your attention to incorporate what's behind you. Now, snap your vision back to attention focused in front of you on the object. And swivel your chair or move your body so that you're facing in a different direction, and do it with another object. Focus on the object and then let that go and focus on the peripheral. Once you feel that you have that capacity now to do this, I suggest that you look at the Enneagram first as an object. You most likely have a drawing of the Enneagram on your desktop. You see it as an object, and then you can switch into the peripheral mode.
I can pull it up, Leslie, too, to share.
You really don't need to.
Yeah.
This is a suggestion. It's one way of looking at diagrams, any diagram. It's really intended to give you a new tool to shift the way you see things. Because for any insight to occur, one has to see something differently. And how do you do that? How do you see something differently? Well, this is one exercise that can assist you into shifting how you see things. And many of you may know other ways of doing this. There's ways of being specific with your intention, like looking at negative spaces between objects, or looking only at things that have the color red. Look at a room and it's like, all you're going to look at is what's red, and everything else will go in the background. Look at things that catch light or things that are in shadow, and make that exclusive. It's like, I'm exclusively looking at shadows. But lately I've been having a lot of fun with the peripheral one. I've been sitting in the garden and going back and forth between specific and peripheral, and it's been quite amazing what I've learned about my garden doing that. That's my little offering, and if anybody has managed to catch a hold of how to do this by little experiment, it'd be nice to hear your feedback.
I was going to throw in Leslie, because I love doing this sometimes with sound. you can get, in a position and you can get focused on a particular sound or some particular, but you change to this other thing, and it can completely change your state, when you do that, and you become aware of this totality of sound around you. Very good.
Well, I really appreciate everybody's feedback. And hope you enjoy playing with this further. It can be done anywhere, anytime. I pass this back to Stephen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leslie.
You're welcome.
Next, Tony, coming back to you now.
Hello. It often strikes me how, if we could pay attention to our seemingly very quite ordinary and accessible experience instead of chasing after extraordinary and fantastical experiences, there are the profound lessons. That is, you get part of, I think, what this sort of exercise by Leslie can convey to us is that we're not paying attention to this ordinary world because we despise this ordinary world. We take it so much for granted, and we think there's nothing in it, nothing to see. But I was so struck over the years with Mr. Bennett, how he would say, it all comes back, it's all, use Bones language actually, to enfold it in our ordinary experience are all the secrets and all the rest of it. We just don't pay our ordinary, so-called ordinary experience any attention, because we're so used to things going like a machine and delivering the things we want, which is part of our culture, that most people say, why do you bother paying attention to your attention? Why do you bother trying to perceive your perception? This is silly. You just get on and make money and achieve your desires and all the rest of it. There's something so profound about paying attention to what's actually there, immediately available to you in our ordinary experience. Now, I say this thing was all called behind the Enneagram, but you see, it's not going to be like, I get really irritated myself about people who write books about the Enneagram, so they tell you what the secret is, and they got these words like the secret of, and the real story of, and where it came from, and all that. Why? Because it's all linear. It's all confined. It's all in terms of who's got the right answer and that kind of thing. Well, no, there are, to put it bluntly and perhaps weirdly, infinite number of interpretations, an infinite number. And people think you're crazy, infinite. One or two, perhaps, not infinite, but infinite. A real symbol has this plenitude within it, which makes it a real symbol. A real symbol is not like something say, oh, I know what that means, like the arrow points to somewhere, or the picture of a man on the door means it's a toilet, and all this kind of thing. But the symbols have depth, and so you mentioned it. You get this feeling of 3 dimensions and many dimensions, and the rest of it. The part then of this unfolding is right from the beginning about the law 3 and the law 7, with that my hesitation about using the word law, which is, I think, very authoritarian and restrictive. But it's still these two sides, which I evoke in myself to appreciate as a stereoscopic vision, as with 2 eyes. And some people are aware of this because they're connected with the 2 sides of the brain and that sort of thing. And I'm reminded of this exercise, the thing about even a bird. You see, the one eye is really, when they're pecking away, is looking at the food they're going to peck at, but the other eye is open to the sky because to be aware of predators. And so this peripheral vision is extremely important. Yeah. So the 3 and the 7, I'll come back to their mutual significance toward the end. But here I want to look at this 3-ness. And I'm going to throw in to the pot, our cooking pot here, the Hermetic dogma, the way up and the way down is one and the same. The Hermetica was basically a document which was, I think, originated in Roman times. It was ascribed to ancient Egypt and so on and so on, like all such wonderful things are ascribed to. But what does this mean, the way up and the way down, the one and the same thing? And why does this belong, I say, to threeness? Well, I have to trot it out because it would take too long and be too bored. I tried to stretch out why I could justify it by saying that this journey, we talked about the journey, but it's, when we think about things, I would say, as a generalization, most of the time, we're always thinking in terms of flatland. And our thinking is like that. And I rather admire the saying of Pak Subu, people know Subu, he said about thinking is on the same level as material objects. But it means that there's not all kinds of thinking like that. So in flatland, you see, so if you look at the things around the Enneagram, they want to put it all on the same level. Now, this wonderful charged word, level, is important. And it was a radical claim in the fourth way in Gurdjieff's teaching that there were different levels. What do we make of that? And words like some things are higher than others. You mean higher, lower? Do you mean 2 meters instead of 1 meter? No, higher in some quality. And because it was trying to preserve, this teaching was part of its remit, was to preserve this language which dealt with the qualitative difference between things, not in terms of their size or physical properties as such, but in terms of their very being. Now, in ordinary social discourse and so on, we talk about processes which are important in our industries and commerce and meaning and making and life and so on. There is this word value added. There's an awful phrase in itself, like you could add it in, like sprinkling salt on something. I know. For Mr. Bennett, it was a crucial thing, this harmony, this clash, this creative marriage between fact and value. The fact is the flat world, the value is the world of different levels. The two things could look the same, but they'd be quite different in how they are, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, inside themselves. Now, can you imagine? My habit is to think of the artistic media, like with painting and pottery and things like that. How you get something which is just a material substance and go through something. And then I'll pause and add in bracket here. When you go through something means the materials go through something, but then there's another level I shall come to and indicate later, which is what you go through. And I just suggest way in advance of the argument that if you're really involved in making meaning, then you yourself have to go through something. Yeah. Will not be unscathed, as they say. So this dimension is what, even we pay for it in commerce. And I repeatedly cite the example of this incredible process of taking a lump of Morse clay out of the soil and going through something which ends up this priceless porcelain cup. It astonishes me. And I've cited Rilke's Do I Know Elegies on this point. say, with astonishes the angels, this work. What is that way? It's the work of transformation, changing the very being of something. With bits thrown in here, it's like from Nietzsche, his famous saying, "Write with blood and I will find their spirit." And the sense of things like sacrifice, so that something can be brought into manifestation. So, imagining then your enneagrams and thorn in the outer circle, which is, my convention, some people do it clockwise, is it's building up, So you can't simply get into some higher level again in the straight line. Why? Because if everything built up if decline and decay, what keeps not only building something up, but maintaining it, like the care taken in, like the trouble Leonardo da Vinci had with his pigmentation in the Last Supper, and to keep this, to preserve it, and so on, how to keep this, and this is itself. I wish I could explain it to you. This itself is a play, well, in terms of evolution and the development of molecular chemistry and all the rest of it, is creating these more higher forms, but in a way which they don't immediately disappear again as soon as they're created. They don't relapse into the fragments again, into the flatland. Can you feel this sense of transformation? The transformation is taken, I think, in the Enneagram and that kind of system as a universal reality. It's not just a subjective human thing, getting a soul, puffing ourselves up or whatever it is, but that it's there all around. You see it, you've seen it in itself. It's just this incredible thing. A plant in the soil absorbing the nutrients in the soil and the water and the sunlight, and then it comes out of it comes this incredible flower. God, it's just extraordinary. So what happens? And it's I said the law of three, or something of three, whatever it is. And bear in mind, this one is, I will say the words, and it might seem just garbage or blah blah. But it's Hanel Miatzno. This is the blending of the higher and the lower to create the middle. Why is it? The higher is in a way is there all the time, but it's to bring it into conjunction with this manifest world. In a way, this is an exaggeration, but in a way you can imagine you're looking around the world and see what you're seeing as corpses. Dead. What's dead? And this death is what's in your memory, your mind. When you begin it, so you touched it with this exercise, And one's got to learn how to do these things and get people to learn how to do these things and keep this perception alive. Unless your perception changes, you don't understand anything differently. The way you see the actual real world that matters. And seeing is in a way the essence of the left-hand side of the Enneagram, whereas doing is more the side of the right-hand side, taking things to do. And usually in the traditional systems, these are put in contrast. And there's a point at which they merge, so that to see is to do, and so on. So I can only wave words around, get this sense of how sweet it is, because you've got this, as to speak, invisible higher, we got the tangible lower, and we bring them together to make something unique. This was so much the teaching of my dear late friend Edward Matchett in his 3M equations. He called it meaning plus matter. He makes meaning, making meaning plus matter meaningful, as his equation of genius, which it is. but you like drawing something out of nothing, bringing it up. So now let me come back to the Enneagram in part, and I said about the circle and it's going clockwise around it. If you take that convention, it's like clockwise, there's a sort of winding up thing, and you can treat it like that. But then the converse, the anti-clockwise, is like the running down. So you got a winding up and a running down. Now these two are called evolution and involution. Can you take the next diagram? I think it was either two or three. There we are. Thank you very, very much. So there are these, you see, the Enneagram has these two sides. Why? Because, well, not why, but the phrase of Hermes, the Hermetica, the way up and the way down is one and the same. Like a ladder, you can climb up it and you can go down it. And so, but I put some extra symbols in at the bottom here, this kind of star thing for the sake of anything, because it's where these two meet. I'll pause and say, add in here that this evolution thing is like, it's climbing steps. These steps are there, these points of equilibrium, so to speak, and you climb up them. And the overall image, of course, for me of evolution, I cannot help myself mentioning this, is to say that I'm intoxicated by the images of the salmon leaping up the waterfall to return to where them as the salmon in the breeding spawning ground do it. And it's a total bloody miracle. Out to sea, and they come find the river, and they go up the river, and they got the waterfalls, and to get back to the spawning ground again. It's evolutionary, this going up back to the source. But then imagine if you can, it's a bit like this lovely phrase of Gurdjieff, Shakespeare, the quality of mercy is not strain, it droppeth as the gentle rain upon the earth beneath. But this sense is coming from the sky, it's coming from it, it's a permeation, but this sense of creation, which it is. But you see, there's these two ambiguity in creation. Creation is like unfolding. Once it's unfolded, it's not folded up, it's spread out. But the other one is the enfolding, which is creating the new. But try to imagine if ever do anything to the Enneagram, the other way. And I've done in my book was, to refer the left-hand side to going down the evolution to what in religion are the prayers, like Our Father who art in heaven. That's where it starts, and that's on the left-hand side, and it begins to go back down. And then the esoteric side is the evolutionary. How does one go through this intoxicating waterfall of God through which we have to pass and ascend? But then you get that side, which Gurdjieff mentioned. He said, this work is against God, is against nature. Why? Because nature is always unfolding. So there's much to ponder about that. I've now unmuted myself, I can hear. Look at the dash at the bottom, you see this in some of the literature. And literature, what is it? It's writing. Why write? It itself is an action. Writing is an action. And they say that this meeting between involution and evolution is life. That is what life is. And so life must be born and die all together. And some vague notion, cosmic motion, the whole universe is held in balance between involution and evolution and things like that. Big ideas, difficult to play with. You have to play with them if you can, but the simple picture gives you that thing at the bottom. And that refers to, first conversation about the journey, where it intimated, I don't know if you noticed, that there was something about the halfway process. And Gurdjieff writes about this actually, that his treatment of the Enneagram in Beelzebub Tales is not quite the same as when he was with Ouspensky. But it introduces not only the two shocks we had before, but a third one, which he called the Harnell out, which is like a mixing of the eight. And the eight is the octave, of course, it's all the notes. But he described it in this wonderful phrase that the point you reach where you're as far from the end as you are from the beginning, as far from the beginning as you are from the end. You're right in the middle, and you don't know where to go. That moment of where you're likely cast out, as I've got it in them, because I get into the mythology, and Gurdjieff is got it where he talks about God sending away his favorite son, which is there at that point. And in when I was with Mr. Bennett, he would refer to that. That's what we would do. We feel it. That point at the bottom is a point of chaos. Chaos is needed because nothing new can come otherwise. And because the word chaos has two meanings. It's not just simply kind of confusion and randomness and so on, but it's also translated originally as yawning gap. Yeah. So it's like, whatever you like, what image comes to your mind, trust your image. It's a black hole, white hole. But it's law of three, and it's finding a point of balance, and the point of balance is the mystery, which then again is talking about in literature, if you like, in poetry, fiction, the third force and all of that, which played so much a part in the teaching what this third force is about. So it comes into play there. They begin to get vista, extraordinary, simple thing about the threefold. I myself like that meaning of the Harnell out, the kind of stuck in the middle, because the middle has very special meanings, and we'll be coming to it in a moment when we'll hear a recorded talk from Michael White, who unfortunately can't be with us, to take up this story. But what is behind the Enneagram, in one description of it, is that it's a century, thousands of years of people trying to make sense of things, trying to create forms to understand them with. Just as Gurdjieff himself said, he and his friends took all this stuff as far as they knew it, which at that time was maybe not all that much from ancient times. He was not very accurate in a lot of the things he said about the ancient times, and make sense of it in modern terms. This is what it's been doing. You find it's actually the same in, or similar to, in the Kabbalah, the tree of life. It evolved over 3 centuries. Then Gurdjieff and his friends knocked something together in a few years. This is a work to do this, and what's behind it is then to see how people did the sort of thing which we might, or some of us might now ascribe to the Enneagram, dating back 5,000 years ago and going on through the ages right into modern times. And so I'm going to hand over, so to speak, figuratively to my colleague Michael White, and because Stephen made a video with him of his talk, and I hope we can see it now.
Thank you, Tony. So yeah, so Michael White, wonderful poet and student of literature, recorded a short talk on ring composition. So I'm going to share that within Zoom.
At our last meeting, Anthony showed us an interesting example from ancient Sumerian cuneiform texts in clay that had a circle on it with 7 points around the outside of the circle, and each of those points represented a day of the week. And then there were lines connecting the various points together, and it ended up in the shape of a star. And it was a very dramatic example of an ancient example of using a circle to make an illustration of a calendar, in fact, and each of the points represented a day of the week, and each day of the week was a god in the pantheon, and each of the gods was a planet, or the planet was a god. And so this was a circle, points around the edges with all the points connected up to make a design that was useful. It could be used like a calendar in a way to illustrate something that was really important that you could use.
Steve, it muted when you muted.
The idea of ring composition. And it turns out that in the ancient world, when writing was invented, it was done in a very different way than it is now. And it was about 5,000 years ago when we invented, we learned how to write. And we learned how to write in 5 different places, totally unconnected. But in ancient China, they had their hieroglyphs. And in Sumeria, they had their cuneiforms, which evolved into the Phoenician alphabet, which we still use today. In the Indus Valley, they developed Sanskrit. And in Egypt, they developed the hieroglyphics. And across the ocean, in the Mayan, in the Mexican culture, the Olmecs came up with their style of writing. So about 3000 BC, something happened in human awareness, and we learned how to write. And when we learned how to write, we wrote in a different way than we do now. And the paradigms that ruled how we wrote in the very beginning of writing were very different from the paradigms that rule in our mind now. And at that time, everything had to be done in a circle. When you looked up, the sun and the moon were circling the earth. The seasons ran through cycles, and everything was seen in terms of cyclic progressions. And they came up with a formula for that called as above, so below. And that was called the Emerald Tablet. We called it the Emerald Tablet because there was a legend that the words as above, so below were engraved on the surface of the pyramids in Egypt. And then they engraved them down into the limestone of the surface and then filled it with emeralds. So it became the Emerald Tablet. Now that's just a legend, and that really came from the Greeks, not from the Egyptians, but it's a wonderful little story. And as above, so below was kind of the E equals MC squared of the ancient world. It was a formula that they used that really defined reality for them, just like E equals MC squared has come to define our reality today. And at that formula, you looked at the heavens above and you saw what the patterns were and how things worked in the heavens. And then you tried to bring that pattern to your own life. And if you could get your life to be in conformity with the patterns and ways that the forces of nature and the forces of the heavens work, then you would be in balance with nature and things would work right for you. So as above, so below. To apply that to writing, we had to do things in a circle, not in a linear way. People didn't even think in a linear way at that time. So there were characteristics of how this worked, and we had 4 main characteristics, and I have a diagram that shows it. Can we pull up that first diagram? So ring composition, it had to happen first in a circle, and you had points along the circle, and you start up at the top and proceed in a clockwise direction, and you come and you make a series of points, and you have a prologue, and then you build these points, and when you get down to the bottom, after you've gone through your main points, you come to a place that's called the turn, or also called the chiasmus. And at that point, that's what we would now consider the conclusion. And they put the meaning of the text in the middle. And then everything that followed after that was resolving the themes that had developed in the first half. And each point related across the circle, like you can see here, in a way so that this was called parallelism. And so the first point, as you start down the circle, related to the last point. Like, so 1 related to 8, 2 related to 7. And as you went around the circle, you first built up your points, you built up what you wanted to say, and then you came to the bottom of the circle where the meaning of what you were saying was resolved. And then you had what happened after that, which had to relate back across the circle. So ring composition worked based on those principles. And when you got back up to the top of the circle, you had to have something there called the latch, which connected you back to the beginning. So that that closed the circle and resolved the whole thing with a new beginning, back where you began, back where you started. So for the next 1,000 years or longer, everything that was written had to be written in that sort of pattern, with ring composition in a circle, making your points, putting the meaning in the middle, and then having the points after that relate back across in this parallel structure, and then coming up to the end where you have a latch that brings you back to where you started and begin a new cycle. Okay, Stephen, that's good for that one. So this thing was quite a puzzle as people in the West began to translate ancient literature and look at it. It didn't work right as far as the translators were concerned. And there was a Oxford Don, his name was Bishop Lowth, and in 1753, he was studying ancient Hebrew literature and looking at the first 5 books of the Torah. And he was finding in there, embedded in the text, some poems that seemed to be older than the other writing in the Old Testament. And he was teasing these out as the oldest examples of writing in the Old Testament. But when he tried to translate them, they didn't come out right. The lines weren't lined up in any order. And he first thought that the text had been corrupted or something was wrong with the way it had been carried down through the ages. But then he had an insight, and he saw that the way this thing worked, if you put it in a circle and have this parallelism and you see the meaning in the middle, that changed everything and made it all work. And so he was the first scholar to uncover this idea of ring composition. And from 1753 to about 1950, scholars all around the world were reaching into ancient literature, finding examples of it, and being able to decipher it and translate it. And as they did, it turned out that there were examples of ring composition in different cultures all around the world. And just like writing had been invented about 3000 BC in 5 different places, this thing of ring composition was ubiquitous among the different cultures, and there were examples of ring composition in all these ancient texts. And by 1950, scholars were beginning to realize that at the beginning of the birth of writing, we wrote in a different way, and they were calling this ring composition and seeing it in different places. So I'd like to give a quick example of that. Stephen, if we can get the other example. This is a story we all know. This is Noah and the Ark from the Old Testament, from the Torah. And we can see that the story begins with Noah and his sons, and you see all the life on the earth, and then people were screwing up, and God places a curse on the earth and announces there's going to be a flood. And he has Noah build the ark, and all the living creatures are brought together, and Noah has to pack away all the food, and God commands that the animals should follow Noah's commands, and they all enter the ark, and here comes the deluge. And then here in the middle, God remembers Noah, and Noah's safe in the ark, and then the waters begin to decrease, and the ark lands, and the animals exit it and go out and find their own food, and the living creatures spread all around the earth, and the ark is there on the mountain, and God promises there'll be no flood in the future, and blesses the earth, and life returns to the earth, and Noah and his sons are back together again on the earth. So you can see how each of the points in the story has a parallel point. And this guy, Gordon Wenham, he couldn't bring himself to put this into a circle. He was, he couldn't break out of the linear paradigm. But this does illustrate how ancient stories worked, and how each point in the story had to have a point across the circle. And then when you come to the end of the circle, you come back to where you began and close the circle. Okay, Stephen, thank you. So in 2007, there was a English anthropologist, a very famous woman named Mary Douglas. She was kind of the leading anthropologist of her day. And she wrote a book called Writing in Rings, and published that. And that brought together all of the research and was the first major study to point out that ring composition was a factor in ancient writings, and to show that when writing was invented for the first 1,000 years or 1,500 years, everything that was written followed this paradigm of ring composition. And they showed how you could see it in ancient cultures from different places. Anybody that learned to write, and during that time period, learned how to do it in a way that involved this kind of going in a circle with parallelism, putting the meaning in the middle, and then having a latch at the end. And then since she published that book in 2007, there has been a proliferation of studies about ring composition. And people have been turning up ring composition, not only in ancient literature, but in some examples of modern literature as well. And one of Anthony's buddies, Simon Wegman, has come up with a beautiful study of Rumi, showing that Rumi's great works have been done using ring composition in certain places. And rings have turned up all over the place. James Joyce did a ring in Finnegan's Wake when he closed it and made it so that there was a latch at the end that brought you back to the beginning. And there are examples of ring composition in the Book of Mormon. And some scholars have recently been looking at Harry Potter and finding examples of ring composition. So now these writers didn't have access to the ancient scriptures or ancient literatures, and didn't know that ring composition was a thing in the ancient world, but they had an intuition that said that they should write in a different way, and were able to intuit a way of writing that created the examples that fall into a paradigm close enough to ring composition. So one of the things that's interesting is Anthony got into this and turned me onto it, and I read about it and was intrigued by it. And Anthony wrote a beautiful book called The Gymnasium of Higher Intelligence, and he wrote it in a ring. And it's one of his master works, and beautifully done. And it has this process of ring composition, and I got inspired by it and wrote a book of poetry and put it in a ring as well. But now let's go back. How does this apply to Gurdjieff and the Enneagram? And so I raised that question with Anthony, and I said, are there any rings in Beelzebub? Well, he sent me a paper that he had read in 2008 at the All and Everything conference, and it was entitled Beelzebub in a Ring. And he showed how there was ring composition in the books in Beelzebub. And so I was fascinated by that, and Gurdjieff had this intuition as well. But to go back into Gurdjieff's thinking, and when he wanted to do the Enneagram, when Gurdjieff wanted to have a symbol that represented his way of thinking, he put it in a circle, and he put points around the circle, and he connected them up. And ever since he invented that, people have been trying to figure out where did he get this idea and how did it work. And Anthony came up with a beautiful quote and sent it to me that when Gurdjieff was in Paris, there was a scholar there named Dennis Surratt, and Surratt got to talk to Gurdjieff and ask him what some of the sources of his work were, and Gurdjieff told him that 30 years ago, about a dozen people got together and spent several years in Central Asia, where they reconstructed the means of oral traditions, study of ancient cultures, from folk songs and even from certain books. So Gurdjieff there kind of talked about how he connected to scholars as a young man, and that they dug into these ancient traditions and began to tease out what was going on in them, and then reconstructed those in their own way, in a modern way, to present that ancient knowledge to us in a way that makes more sense to us now, in a way that represented their own thinking. And it was also the case that Gurdjieff's father was a bard. There's the famous story that we've all heard, that Gurdjieff's father knew the legend of Gilgamesh and was able to recite the story of Gilgamesh even before it was found in the Sumerian tablets, and that there was an oral tradition, and his father was part of it, and Gurdjieff was also keyed into that. So when Gurdjieff wanted to create his own symbol, he put it in a circle, and he put points around the circle, and he drew lines to connect them all up. And he did it in a way different from either the Sumerian circle of the calendar or the process of ring composition, and created his own thing. And now we have the Enneagram. And as we look back to see how he did that, we can see that there were different examples of ways to use rings and ways to connect the points. So I found that interesting and got to read Anthony's paper about Beelzebub and really enjoyed that, and have explored this idea of ring composition and found it to be very intriguing and interesting, and it appears to be something that Gurdjieff ran across and used in his own way, and created the Enneagram, and that has carried down to us today. So I'll pass it back to Anthony now, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with everybody these kind of insights. Thanks very much.
And then Tony, you can continue on.
Thank you. It's maybe a little difficult to assimilate all at once, this sort of information, but I want to clarify some possible points which need to be said. That is to say, Michael Riley talked about writing in a circle, but they didn't have a sheet of paper and put the writing in a circle. The circle was in their awareness, their mind. This was a mental visualization of it. So that, and initially you come across and you think, well, why isn't there in ancient times a sort of textbook on how to write ring composition? There isn't a textbook on how to do it. Why? Because everybody was doing it. What was the point of writing an essay on how to do it? If you can get that to know. So it was there. It's one of the, I think, extraordinary things that there it was, so to speak, all the time. And it was only because the scholars wrestled with this idea and said, why are these, as Michael said, some of these texts, which the Hebrew texts in the Bible and so on, like the Book of Numbers, it was just, as far as a piece of writing was concerned, were looked at as garbage. I mean, like babble is incoherence and doesn't make sense or anything like this. But once they had found this key, then it all began to make sense. You will not, as I say, you will not find any ancient text, with a diagram with the thing in the circles and thinking with words around the circle and so on. And this is, part because, of course, people in those earlier times had very much more powers of visualization than we have today, because we're so used to graphic support. But now I want to come to this issue of making a deep connection between ring composition and the Enneagram. What do I mean by deep connection? As I say, is there in some way in which they could be regarded as very alike or the same? And there is. I think I want to ask for picture 3. I hope I've chosen the right number. Help
Just a
you.
moment.
Yes. Now, this diagram here you see is actually, you may not forget all the numbers around it for the moment. I had to do it all around. And say, this is the essential structure of a ring composition. And what do we have here? We have this vertical line from their language, the latch to the turn. And you have the horizontal thing, which is actually an oscillation. It goes 3, 1, 3, 1. Now, how does it do an oscillation? Why is this? And how does it relate to the Enneagram? So what I have to do is to take a particular step here. The 0.4 up there is equivalent to, in the Enneagram, because it's the 0.4, there's 4 and 0. I haven't put the 0 in, but it's a 4 and 0. As in the Enneagram, we've got 9 and 0, the same kind of principle. But now, taking the vertical line down to number 2, to what in the ring composition is called the turn, this is the equivalent in a way, and you might say, I'm stretching things, fine, equivalent of the shocks in the Enneagram, but it's one in one place. There's only one place where you get this kind of element we can roughly call a shock. But just dwell on it a bit if you can, and remember what I said about 3 and 1, an oscillation. So why? Because can we anticipate this and say, go forward? The Enneagram, you see, the equivalent to that in the Enneagram is the hexatic cycle. There's a cycle, you see, here it's reduced to its very simplest form. And the mathematics of it is 0.13131313 and so on, or 0.31313113 on and so on. Now, what are these numbers I've just thrown at you? And what do these things I've written here, A equals 2, B equals 3, N equals 4, it's fine. Well, looking at all of this, I wondered, well, what's going on here in relation to the Enneagram? And I want you to think of the Enneagram, and I want you to think of the 2 numbers it contains, the 3 and the 7. And I want you to add 3 to 7, in which I'm sure you can do, it equals 10. 10 represents what we call usually the decimal system. It's a system which contains 10 digits from 0 to 9. But it's only within the decimal system that you get this thing which Gurdjieff demonstrated, like 1/7. Remember the sevenfoldness, 1/7. And you get this recurring decimal, 1.42587, 1.442587, and so on and so on. Running round and round. If you take 2 7s, you start with 2 and so on. You get all the ring, but it comes from, only works in the decimal system. And this, remember, this decimal system really came sort of integrated part of practice in the 12th century in Europe. And you think, well, that's fine. No, but what about this thing here? It looks like a fourfold scheme. What's going on here? And I think, well, if we had 3 plus 7 equals 10, what if we started with 2 instead of 3? As leads us the obvious speculation, 2 plus 3 equals 5. Notice the bottom left-hand corner, base 5. No. Now, this is a very difficult thing to throw to you at the end, and maybe hard for you to assimilate, because you have to know about number bases. We're used to the decimal system. In England, we used to have the duodecimal system based on 12. Now, ubiquitous is the binary system based on 2. So this is the binary system here, not the binary system, sorry, this is later, comes in here. And so, we begin to see an emergence here. 2 laws indicating behind them a number base in which you do all your calculations. So base 5 in the Enneagram is base 10. Now, can we say more about this pattern emerging here? Well, I won't subject you to the homework, but you might actually try it, because you do work out doing division and so on in the different bases. You use the base 5 and find out what 1/3 is in base 5. And you work out this recurrent decimal, 0.3131331, you see. And I think that's very curious. Then what about the line, this vertical line? What does it signify? Well, the obvious thing layering the base is this twofold. This is a twofold thing, whereas the Enneagram is threefold. And Gurdjieff was very much a threefold man. He loved the threefold, you see. So we got transposition here from thinking in terms of a primary law, which I've got here, A equals 2. So when you come to the Enneagram, the primary law is A equals 3. And then you start doing some simple arithmetic and say, well, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. And are there other possibilities here? But remind you again that in the Enneagram, the master number is actually 10. That's because that encompasses the 3 and the 7 together. And it's from this that these geometrical forms are created. But can you imagine, now can we think of ourselves as going more deeply and say, can we get, it sounds absurd, instead of the primary law being 2, let's make it 1. And if you do all the corresponding arithmetic to 2, then the other law has to also to be 1. So this is the binary system, and the 2 numbers involved in it are 0 and 1. And this is what I call then the monogram. I'll show it a little bit later, I hope. Well, I might show it. Do the next one, Stephen, please, the next diagram. All right, you think about this. It's so nice to be able to do it sort of live on the blackboard or something, and then you could interrupt me and ask questions about the details, and I'm sorry. Yeah. We'll have to do some mathematical sums. Because I'm trying to conjure up in you the whole series here. Okay, so this is when you get the primary law being the law of 1. You think this is crazy. Well, this is what Bennett got into with his systematics, the monad, and so on. And as I've spelt it out into a certain way. You see, it has this extraordinarily simple diagram of just the two circles, if you get any of it. If you look at them and find ways to interpret them, you get this is extraordinary. This is the monogram. The whole notion of the monad which Bennett had is contained in this. Now think back to what we had before. You see, well, it had 4 elements, so it's a tetra. It's a tetragram. 4 is the tetra. Then you get the enneagram, which is 9. Now, then you get what can happen if we go above the enneagram. And maybe I got to throw in a hexadecigram, which has 16 points to it. And it might go on. So what is in front of us is a series of possible forms with all containing this pattern, where we have what I call the primary or informing law, I call A, which is, I said before, with the enneagram with the logos, informs it. Yeah. Then the unfolding law, the B, is a complement to it. And it's a whole family of them can be created. And you might say, well, why bother? You know? Well, I think that for me, one of the strong points about bothering is not to get stuck on a particular example. As you see, Gurdjieff was quite dogmatic. He said, there is the law of 3 and the law of 7, that's it. Bennett went along with it for some time, but then he gradually freed himself from that and went into a wider world. It's like you can only understand, in a way, understand what's in the Enneagram by seeing its alternatives, its possibilities, and they're both before and after. And there's tetragram and the hexadecigram. So forgive me if you might find it just trivial or meaningless to go into these other possibilities with this. It is in this world of possibilities, and it is to do with what's behind the Enneagram. So what's behind the Enneagram is this law, kind of pattern, and in its completely abstract form, goes back to the triad A plus B equals C, which everybody knows. But it's more mysterious, like all these things. You look at the most simple thing, the most mysterious, like those, I know 10 years ago, suddenly a Japanese published a proof related to this thing A plus B plus C. And it said that still only 5 people on the planet understand this proof. And you think, well, it's obvious, you know, right? No, it's not. So what is this? It is to see that implicit in the Enneagram, as we suggested through Michael's talk, are other forms which just have a similar pattern. And in that similar pattern, you see something which is usually left out in the Enneagram. That's the bottom middle point, the turning, which I related to Gurdjieff's Handel out, the middle of it, which has enormous implications in musical theory, because it's the position mathematically of the square root of 2. In India is the symbol of Agni, the god of fire, and which Bennett brought in his account of the kitchen. So he put that point there in the bottom. He called it fire. And he never really justified it. But in fact, that was behind the Enneagram. So these which don't appear explicitly are there implicitly in all these different forms. So now we're getting to almost the end now. And I think the next diagram, please, Stephen. I'm going to shock you with this. We get something a bit more fun in a moment. Don't despair. No. Is that the last one? No, isn't it? Okay, well, I'll deal with this, right? Come on. This is the hexadecigram with 16 points on it. Why it's got G on the top anyway. And what you see, the dotted line you see is a square. So it's the fourfold rule. And also these complicated intersecting lines are 2 hexatic cycles. And there's a whole cornucopia of forms which arise from this. I want to go back if I can. There's a one in the images. And you see, actually, it's a very awkward number base 17. I really fear I'm going to leave you with scrambled brains, but never mind. There's always T.
So Tony, which diagram are you looking for?
The one before, the one you just showed, I mean, was it 3?
Ah, I see. Okay. Just a moment then.
Oh no, is that one, is it? Oh,
That's number 4. The 16 was number 5.
that was fun. Okay, well, I sent you originally were 4 diagrams, but it hasn't come through. All right, so we leave it.
Is it 3 with a tetragram?
Yeah, we'll go back to that.
Okay.
So just think that where would you start from? And all you're really starting from, that's 3. And number 4. Remember, that's a tetragram on base 5. See what happens next.
This is what I have as diagram number 4.
Okay, well, you? Oh, that. All right, so didn't work. Go to number 5 then.
And this is what I have as 5. Oops, sorry, there's a delay. Give me a moment.
Okay. And leave it there with you, because I also want you to feel all the kind of thinking of, please say, what I'm talking about is nonsense, pointless, whatever it is. There is a pragmatics in this. The Gurdjieff Enneagram is about as complex as one can fairly easily handle. This is getting a pretty wacko. But just to give you a hint about one way of interpreting this hexadecagram in concrete terms is of the calendar and the 4 seasons, and the 3 months in each season and so on, which gives you a different perspective on this, how it could be related to ancient calendars. So that's an F for me. But this is then drawing your attention to a realm of possibilities which are, so to speak, seething in the plethora of implicit forms behind the Enneagram. And there may be many other things to be discovered, because any of these things has to be, so to speak, marketed and fostered and so on to become established in people. Going back to ring composition, I want to emphasize, of course, I'd say there's no book written describing ring composition or reference to it because it was taken for granted in practice. And the people and scholars are very careful they don't just project the idea onto things they like to fancy. Some of it is very explicit, like there's a poem by Dylan Thomas where he numbers his lines and they go forward and then backwards. And I will say something more about that going backwards to add to Michael's talk, which is to do with the psychological practice. Some of you may have done it, the recapitulation practice. At the end of the day, you recall the day, but not from dawn to dusk, but backwards. And the recapitulation is done backwards. And it's given, in terms of psychological practice, a great deal of significance that you do it backwards. No, forgive me if I've ruined everything for you and given you sleepless nights and so on. But just to inform you, I've tried to be writing about the Enneagram and what's behind it and so on. It's so rich it's kind of defeating me because it's so rich and complex, and it's far more interesting than the usual garbage about decoding the Enneagram and that kind of stuff. Because it is what the man said. He looked at this ancient stuff and tried to modernize it. They pick up things from what people actually did. And you see, like any writer knows, the main thing to help your writing is reading and seeing these sorts of things. But just to give you some encouragement at the end, Stephen, we're going to go to the number 17. I hope it works out. We've got a link here. Mm-hmm. And this movement in which you see the permutations of the inner lines of the Enneagram at work, and just see if you can make sense of the pattern. But meanwhile, thank you for your patience. Good night and God bless.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to drop the link to, again, play back in YouTube, another video of movement 17, unless I have things mixed up. You'll be hearing, movement number 17, and you'll be hearing from us probably later in the week when we decide for the date of part 3 of the series.
Inshallah. Thank you.